The struggle of the young man. In a small rural village nestled at the edge of a vast, lush forest, there lived a young man named Lemmy. Raised by his devoted mother, he had known little but hardship. The village, with its narrow dirt paths and humble thatched huts, had provided a simple, albeit tough, life for them both. Lemmy's mother, a tireless woman, had worked tirelessly to ensure he had an education. Though the village itself was steeped in age-old customs, Lemmy had always longed for more, a life that reached beyond the boundaries of superstition and tradition. Lemmy was a man of intellect and ambition. He had attended university in a distant city, where he excelled in his studies. His mind was sharp, filled with progressive ideas, and he was eager to embrace the modern world. But as his education grew, so did his distance from his village's traditional ways. His mother, though proud of her son's achievements, could not shake the nagging fear that the very education she had worked so hard to give him might distance him from everything they had ever known. She worried that Lemmy was forgetting the importance of their beliefs and values, ones that had been passed down for generations. One day, after years away, Lemmy returned to his village. The town rejoiced at his return, for it had been a long time since anyone had come back with such accolades. But Lemmy's return was not as joyous as they had hoped. He was not the same young man who had left. He had seen the world through a different lens, and that lens was now clouded with skepticism about the very things that defined the village's culture. The village's most sacred tradition was the worship of a massive serpent that lived within the sacred river that ran through their land. The serpent, believed to possess mystical powers, was said to bring fortune and protection to the people. The elders of the village, wise in their years, had long revered the great snake, offering rituals and prayers to ensure its favor. But Lemmy, with his education and rational thinking, rejected these beliefs outright. To him, the serpent was nothing more than a wild animal, its mythical status nothing but a superstition. He was frustrated by the village's adherence to such old ways, which he saw as the chains holding them back from progress and development. He believed the villagers' fear of the serpent kept them from embracing the scientific world, which could bring real, tangible improvements to their lives. His defiance was evident when he spoke out in front of the elders during a village gathering. He argued that clinging to these outdated beliefs was preventing the village from growing, that their devotion to a serpent was nothing more than a barrier to modernity. The elders listened in silence, their faces etched with years of wisdom and tradition. His mother, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt her heart sink with worry. She knew Lemmy's heart was in the right place, but she feared he was pushing away the very essence of their village's identity. In his fervor, Lemmy didn't see the hurt in his mother's eyes. He didn't understand the depth of their bond to the serpent, the role it played not just as a protector, but as a symbol of everything that had kept them alive through generations. His mother, though silently anguished, could not bring herself to confront him. How could she challenge the very knowledge she had fought so hard to give him, a dangerous challenge? Lemmy's defiance only grew as time passed. His beliefs, strengthened by his education and new way of thinking, filled him with an unshakable certainty that the traditions of the village were nothing more than a chain that bound its people to a life of ignorance. His mother, though deeply concerned, could not understand how her son, once so gentle and kind, had become so driven by his convictions that he would risk everything to challenge the very beliefs that had sustained their village for centuries. Despite her pleas for him to stop, Lemmy was determined. He believed that the people would never truly be free unless they rejected the superstitions that held them in fear. And so, one moonless night, he made a fateful decision. He would prove the snake's power was nothing more than a myth. The serpent, revered as the guardian of the sacred river, was believed to possess the ability to bring fertility, safety, and fortune to the village. At the heart of the belief was the legend of the serpent's eggs, considered to be the ultimate symbol of the goddess's power. Without these eggs, the serpent's protection would supposedly be broken. In the dead of night, when the village lay asleep, Lemmy slipped away, determined to steal the serpent's eggs from the sacred grove. His footsteps were light, and his breath quickened as he made his way toward the river. The grove where the serpent's eggs were said to lie was thick with ancient trees, the air heavy with a sense of both awe and dread. To the villagers, it was a place that should not be disturbed. To Lemmy, it was just another piece of superstition to be torn down. As he approached the grove, Lemmy felt the weight of his actions pressing on him. But his resolve was strong. He had to prove to his people that the snake was no god, that the power they so feared was nothing more than an illusion. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the nest, carefully unearthing the precious eggs. But just as he was about to take them, the ground beneath him shifted. A sudden rustle in the underbrush caught his attention, and before he could react, a hiss split the silence. The massive serpent appeared from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixated on him. It was a creature unlike anything Lemmy had ever seen, its scales shimmered in the moonlight, and its size seemed to stretch beyond what should have been possible. The serpent struck with terrifying speed, coiling around him and biting into his arm with a force that made his blood run cold. Lemmy screamed in agony as the venom coursed through his veins, but his body was already beginning to numb. He struggled, trying to break free, but the serpent's grip was unrelenting. In that moment, Lemmy realized just how deeply he had misjudged the power of the snake. What he had thought of as a myth was real, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. After what seemed like an eternity, the serpent released him, slithering back into the shadows. Lemmy, weakened and barely conscious, stumbled toward the village, his body bloodied and bruised from the encounter. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear: he had failed, and the price was more than he had bargained for. When he finally reached his home, his mother was waiting. She gasped in horror as she saw her son, his body covered in deep, painful wounds, his skin pale and sleek with sweat. He had barely the strength to explain what had happened, but his mother understood immediately. She knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face, praying for his recovery, despite knowing that his defiance had brought this suffering upon him. Meanwhile, the elders gathered, their faces grim. The village had always believed that those who defied the serpent's power were punished. To them, Lemmy's injury was no coincidence, it was the god's retribution for his sacrilege. They blamed him for angering the serpent, and they believed that the village's protection was now in jeopardy. Lemmy's defiance had led him to this moment, a moment of pain, regret, and fear. His mother, torn between her love for her son and her faith in the traditions of the village, could only hope that this was not the beginning of something much worse. Facing the village elders, Lemmy's injuries had barely healed, but his stubbornness had not wavered. The venom in his blood had made him weak, and his body still bore the marks of the serpent's bite, but his mind remained firm. The elders had already begun murmuring about his defiance, and his mother, devastated by his reckless actions, could only watch as her son grew more unyielding. Though Lemmy was in pain, he refused to acknowledge it as the price for his rebellion. Sitting before the village elders, who had gathered to discuss his actions, Lemmy's arrogance burned bright. He mocked them for their ancient ways, scoffing at their belief in the serpent goddess's power. "You're trapped in the past," he said, his voice sharp. "You've allowed fear to dictate your lives, believing in a creature that is nothing more than an overgrown reptile. My education has shown me that there's no magic here, just superstition." The elders listened to his words in silence, their faces hardening with each passing moment. The years of wisdom and tradition they carried weighed heavy in their hearts, and the anger in their eyes was unmistakable. They had tolerated his disrespect long enough, but they knew the matter had gone beyond a mere disagreement. The very balance of their village was at stake. The goddess of the serpent, angered by Lemmy's actions, had stirred the river's waters in violent torrents. The crops were failing, and the animals were beginning to perish. It was no coincidence, the elders believed. Lemmi's defiance had incited the wrath of the serpent goddess, and they feared the worst. "You have mocked the gods, Lemmi," one of the elders spoke, his voice like gravel. "And the goddess demands justice. You stand before us, unrepentant, yet the price of your crime will be dire." Lemmi, still convinced of his own righteousness, merely chuckled. "Let her do her worst. I will not bow to such fairy tales." The tension in the air was palpable. The elders had come to a conclusion, one that would forever alter the course of Lemmi's life. They rose to their feet, their faces grim as they turned their gaze upon him. "You are given an impossible choice," said the eldest of the village, his voice cold. "The goddess demands an offering, and it must come from you. You must marry the serpent goddess as penance for your actions, or within 3 days, you will succumb to the venom of the snake. The choice is yours." Lemmi froze, the word sinking deep into his mind. Marry the serpent goddess. The very idea seemed absurd, and yet there it was, an ultimatum. His education, his reason, his belief in progress, it all seemed meaningless in the face of such an impossible demand. His pride, however, refused to bend. "I will not submit to this madness," he spat, still determined to reject everything the elders had offered. "You can kill me if you wish, but I will not marry a goddess who does not exist." But as the words left his mouth, he saw the steely resolve in the eyes of the elders. There was no turning back now. His defiance had pushed the village to the brink, and the very thing he had tried to prove wrong, the power of the serpent, was now threatening to claim his life. The elders turned away, leaving Lemmi to contemplate the impossible choice that lay before him. The days ahead would bring him closer to a truth he could no longer deny. The belief he had so vehemently rejected was far more than a story. And if he did not act quickly, it could cost him everything. As Lemmi sat alone in the quiet of his home, he couldn't help but wonder what had become of the man he once was, the young man with a vision for the future. And now, faced with an impossible decision, he could only wait for the serpent's wrath to descend. A reluctant marriage. The days leading up to the ceremony were filled with an unbearable tension. The village had begun to prepare for the ritual with a heavy heart, knowing that this was the only way to appease the serpent goddess and end the suffering that had plagued their land since Lemmi's defiance. The elders had spoken of the importance of the ceremony for restoring balance, but to Lemmi, it felt like nothing more than a farce, a humiliating submission to a myth he refused to believe. He had been given no choice. His pride, his education, and his defiance had led him here, to a place where he could not outrun the consequences of his actions. As the ceremony drew nearer, Lemmi felt a deep sense of resentment growing inside him. He had never been a man to yield to superstition, but now, with his life hanging by a thread, he found himself bound by the very beliefs he had mocked. The venom in his veins still burned, a cruel reminder of the serpent's wrath, and he knew that if he did not follow through with this ritual, death would be waiting for him. His mother, distraught and heartbroken, had pleaded with the elders for mercy, asking them to find another way to save her son. She could not bear to watch her child marry a goddess that existed only in the midst of their people. But the elders were resolute. There was no time left for debate. The village's future depended on Lemmi's compliance, and the ceremony must take place immediately. Lemmi could feel his mother's eyes on him as he prepared for the ritual. Her sorrow was a palpable thing, and it gnawed at his conscience. How had it come to this? The woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life was now forced to witness the very thing she feared the most, the public humiliation of her son, bound to a belief he had long since rejected. Lemmi's heart ached as he saw her trembling, her face a mixture of grief and helplessness. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Lemmi had ever imagined. The village elders, robed in ceremonial garb, led him to the sacred river where the great serpent had been said to dwell. The air was thick with incense, and the soft chants of the villagers echoed through the trees. The ground was covered with petals, and the river sparkled in the moonlight, as if it too was aware of the ritual that was about to unfold. Lemmy was made to stand before a massive stone altar, its surface carved with intricate symbols that represented the serpent goddess. The villagers, gathered in silent reverence, watched as the elders began to chant in unison. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Every eye was upon him, and in that moment, Lemmy could feel the weight of his defiance, the heavy consequences of his actions pressing down on his shoulders. The ritual itself was a surreal blur to Lemmy. He stood stoically as the elders performed the rites, his mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. He loathed every second of it. To him, this was nothing more than a ritual of submission, a sacrifice of his will to appease a goddess he didn't believe in. Yet, as much as he wanted to rebel, he knew he had no other choice. His pride had been his undoing, and now, he would pay the price for it. As the ceremony continued, Lemmy's thoughts drifted to the escape he had secretly planned. He had made up his mind that once the ritual was over, he would flee. He would make his way into the wilderness, far from the reach of the village and its suffocating beliefs. He would find a way to break free from the grip of this tradition, no matter the cost. But as the final words of the ritual were spoken, and the elders prepared to complete the ceremony, Lemmy's mother approached him. Her eyes were red from crying, but she stood tall, her voice trembling as she whispered in his ear. "Lemmy, please, this is not the way. Please don't do this." Her plea hit him like a punch to the gut. He had never seen her so broken, so desperate. He knew that in her heart, she was asking him to choose life over defiance, tradition over rebellion. And for a brief moment, Lemmy found himself at a crossroads, torn between the woman who had given him everything and the beliefs that had shaped his very identity. But then, the elders moved forward, their hands raised to signal the end of the ceremony. Lemmy's fate was sealed. As the final chant echoed through the air, Lemmy knew that there was no turning back. Whether he believed in the serpent or not, he was now bound to it. His life, his future, his very freedom, everything was now in the hands of the ancient forces he had once denied. In that moment, standing on the altar beneath the moonlit sky, Lemmy realized that the real battle had just begun. The serpent may have won this round, but in the depth of his heart, he could not shake the burning desire to prove his own will, to escape the fate that had been thrust upon him. Escape and a new life. The night after the ceremony was the darkest Lemmy had ever known. He could still feel the weight of the ritual, the sting of the elders' words, the distant echoes of his mother's plea. But despite the pain and humiliation, there was a fire burning within him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He could not, would not, be bound by their beliefs any longer. As the village slept, Lemmy slipped away from the altar, careful to make no sound. His heart pounded in his chest, and the venom from the snake still lingered in his body, making him weak, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The elders thought they had broken him, that they had forced him into submission, but Lemmy knew better. This was just another obstacle, another barrier to his freedom, and he would find a way to overcome it. With the sound of his footsteps muffled by the earth beneath him, Lemmy made his way into the forest. The path was familiar, but this time, it felt like the last time he would walk it. His home, his past, the village he had known all his life, he was leaving it all behind. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but there was no turning back now. He had to go, to break free from the chains that bound him, to start anew. The journey was long, and the road was uncertain. Lemmy traveled by night and rested by day, hiding from the eyes of any who might see him. His body was still weak from the venom, but his determination pushed him forward. After days of travel, he finally arrived at a bustling city, a place so far removed from the village and its superstitions that Lemmy could scarcely believe he was truly free. The city was alive with energy, the streets teeming with people from all walks of life. It was a world that felt alien to Lemmy, but it was also a world full of possibilities. Here, he could be anyone he wanted to be. The past, with all its burdens, seemed a distant memory. But even in this new place, he felt the pull of his old life, the fear of being hunted down by the villagers, the constant reminder of the serpent's power. It was in this city that Lemmy met Jola. She was kind-hearted and sharp-witted, a woman who had carved out a life for herself amidst the chaos of the city. She saw Lemmy standing on the street corner, looking lost and out of place. With a warm smile, she approached him and struck up a conversation. In the few moments they spoke, she saw through the mask of his pride, sensing the fear and sorrow that lay beneath. Lemmy, reluctant at first, found himself opening up to her. He told her about the village, the ceremony, the serpent, and his defiance. As he spoke, Jola listened intently, her eyes wide with shock. The story she heard was one of rebellion, faith, and punishment, a world so different from the city she knew. But despite the shock, there was no judgment in her eyes. She simply offered him a roof over his head, a place to rest, and a chance to rebuild. "You've been through so much," Jola said softly, after Lemmy finished recounting his tale. "But you don't have to carry this weight forever. The past can shape us, but it doesn't have to define us. You're here now, and there's a whole world of possibilities for you." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within Lemmy. He had been so focused on escaping his past, on proving that his way was the right way, that he had never stopped to think about what came next. What was he supposed to do now? Who was he without his defiance, without his fight? Jola's encouragement was a lifeline in the chaos of his thoughts. She showed him the city, helped him find work, and, most importantly, gave him the space to begin anew. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized that he had been running from more than just the village, he had been running from himself. As the days turned into weeks, Lemmy slowly began to rebuild his life. The city was full of opportunities, work, new friendships, and a sense of freedom he had never known. He found solace in the simple acts of living, waking up in the morning without the weight of the village's expectations, spending his evenings in the quiet company of Jola. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of peace. But the memories of his past were never far from his mind. The serpent's gaze, the whispers of the village elders, the pain he had caused his mother, all of it lingered in the corners of his mind. Lemmy knew that he could never completely escape the past, but he could choose how it shaped him moving forward. Jola's friendship and support gave him the strength to begin letting go of the anger and resentment that had consumed him for so long. She had shown him that sometimes, the hardest battle is the one we fight within ourselves. And with every passing day, Lemmy grew a little more at peace with who he was and where he had come from. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer controlled him. Lemmy had found a new life, a life not defined by the serpent, by tradition, or by defiance, but by the choices he made and the future he was now free to create transformation and redemption. Lemmy's days in the bustling city bled into one another, each one a new opportunity, a fresh start. With Jola's steady support and his own determination, he began to build a life that seemed impossible when he had first arrived, lost and full of bitterness. He no longer sought to prove himself through defiance or rejection of everything his village had stood for. Instead, Lemmy began to realize that true strength came not from resisting the past, but from using what he had learned to shape a future that was his own. Jola had shown him a new world, one filled with innovation, technology, and progress. At first, Lemmy's knowledge of the modern world was limited to his formal education and his skepticism about tradition. But as he immersed himself in the city's fast-paced world, he found that technology held the key to more than just material success. It was a way to connect people, to create change, and to solve problems that once seemed impossible. Lemmy's education, once the source of his arrogance and distance from his roots, began to reveal its true value. He took up a new profession, diving into the world of tech. Though the work was challenging, Lemmy quickly proved himself to be a quick learner, his mind sharp and eager to absorb the knowledge he needed. He learned the intricacies of software development, business strategy, and engineering, all the while remaining grounded in the lessons of his own past. His belief in progress, once driven by a need to escape his heritage, was now rooted in a desire to build something meaningful, something that could help others. With time, Lemmy's hard work paid off. He rose from a humble worker in a small tech company to a respected entrepreneur in his own right. He founded his own tech startup, one that focused on developing affordable solutions for underserved communities. He knew the value of opportunity, having been given a second chance by Jola, and he was determined to pass the opportunity on to others like him, people who had the potential but lacked the resources to break free from their circumstances. As Lemmy's business grew, so did his reputation. He became a beacon of hope for many, a symbol of transformation and redemption. He had once been the young man who defied everything and everyone in his pursuit of something better. Now, he was the one offering opportunities, helping others climb out of poverty, and using his skills to make a real difference in the world. Lemmy's success was no longer about proving the world wrong, it was about building a future that embraced both his past and his present. But despite all the success, the ghost of his past still lingered. Lemmy's mind often wandered back to the village, to the elders, to his mother, and the ceremony that had forever changed the course of his life. Though he had found success and peace in the city, there was a part of him that remained unresolved. The mistakes he had made, the way he had treated his mother and the traditions that had once been part of him, these things could not be ignored forever. One evening, as Lemmy sat alone in his office, looking over the future plans for his company, the weight of his past finally became too much to bear. He realized that while he had transformed on the outside, becoming a respected entrepreneur, a man of success, he had never fully confronted the pain he had caused. He had run from his mistakes, thinking that by starting anew, he could leave them behind. But deep down, Lemmy knew he could not move forward without facing what he had done. The decision was not easy, but it was necessary. He had to return to the village. Not as a young man seeking to change everything, but as someone who had grown and learned the value of humility. He had to make amends, not just for his own peace of mind, but for his mother's, and for the people he had once called his own. Lemmy's heart was heavy as he prepared for the journey back. He knew the village would have changed, that the elders would not simply forgive him. But he had to face them, to face his mother, and to make things right. He had built a new life, but redemption could only be found if he reconciled with the past. As the days passed and Lemmy made his way back to the village, he knew that this journey would not be about reclaiming his old life, but about embracing the lessons of his transformation. He had learned that growth was not just about success or defiance, but about understanding one's past and using it to create a better future. When he arrived at the village, Lemmy was met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The elders, now older and wiser, had heard of his success, but they did not know what to make of his return. His mother, though older as well, still carried the pain of the past, but there was a softness in her eyes as she saw her son standing before her once again. Lemmy's first words were simple, but they held the weight of everything he had carried with him. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady. "I hate you all. And I want to make things right." The road to redemption would not be quick or easy, but Lemmy knew it was a journey he had to take. His transformation was not just in the life he had built, but in the reconciliation that would follow. As he looked out over the village, he realized that this was the true test of his growth, not in what he had achieved, but in what he had learned, and in how he would now use that knowledge to heal the wounds of the past. Return to the village. Years had passed since Lemmy had left the village, years filled with growth, struggle, and the pursuit of a life far removed from the small, isolated world he had known. He had changed, learned, and found his place in a city that welcomed his vision and his intellect. But no matter how far he had gone or how much success he had achieved, there was one thing that always tugged at his heart: his mother, the village, and the unresolved pain he had left behind. Lemmy knew that in order to truly heal, he had to return. Not as the arrogant young man who had mocked tradition and defied everything he once knew, but as someone who had learned the value of humility, balance, and understanding. The time had come for him to reconcile with the past, to offer something that could bridge the gap between the old ways and the new world he had embraced. The journey back was long and filled with anticipation. Lemmy's heart beat faster with each step as he neared the village. When he arrived, the familiar sights, the old river, the sacred grove, the faces of the villagers, brought a rush of memories, both bitter and sweet. This was where it all began, where his rebellion had started and where, in some way, his redemption would end. The village had changed in his absence. The elders, though still holding on to their reverence for the serpent, had seen the effects of modernization creeping in slowly. The younger generation, many of whom had left to pursue education or work in the cities, had begun to question the old ways. Yet, the tradition still held a powerful grip on the village, a grip that had, in many ways, kept them from embracing the potential of a brighter future. Lemmy's first stop was the home he had once shared with his mother. His heart tightened as he approached the familiar hut, the place where his journey had begun. The door creaked open, and there, standing before him, was his mother. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were the same, soft yet full of wisdom. There was a moment of silence, the weight of years between them. But then, she smiled, her expression a mixture of surprise and love. "Lemmy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never thought I would see you again." Tears welled in Lemmy's eyes as he stepped forward, taking his mother's hands in his. The years of anger, hurt, and misunderstanding melted away in that simple moment. He had never fully realized how much he had missed her, how much he had longed for her acceptance, until now. "I'm sorry, Mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I was wrong. I was foolish." His mother's hands tightened around his, and she pulled him into an embrace, as if trying to make up for the lost years in one simple hug. "I never stopped loving you, Lemmy. But I prayed every day for you to find your way back, to see the truth in your own time." As they stood there, reunited and healing the bond that had been broken, Lemmy realized how much he had changed. He had gone from rejecting everything his village stood for to understanding that progress and tradition were not mutually exclusive. They could coexist, if only the village was willing to embrace both. The next step was not easy, but Lemmy knew it was necessary. He approached the elders, who had once seen him as a threat to their way of life. They had grown old, their faces weary, but their authority still remained intact. It was time to bridge the gap between the wisdom of the past and the promise of the future. Lemmy spoke to them not with arrogance, but with respect. He acknowledged the strength of their traditions, the role they had played in keeping the village safe for generations. And then, he offered them something new, something that could bring the village into the future without erasing the past. He spoke of modern technology, of ways that they could use it to solve the very problems that had plagued them for years. He spoke of renewable energy, efficient farming techniques, and education for the younger generation. Lemmy showed them that technology didn't have to erase their beliefs, instead, it could complement them, bringing new solutions to old problems. At first, the elders were hesitant, unsure of how to reconcile their ancient beliefs with the world that Lemmy spoke of. But over time, they began to see the possibilities. The younger generation, eager for change, rallied behind Lemmy's ideas. Together, they worked to introduce new technologies that would help the village thrive without losing the heart of its traditions. The transformation was slow but steady. The village began to prosper, its people more connected, healthier, and more educated. The sacred grove, once feared and revered, was no longer just a symbol of superstition. It became a place of both spiritual significance and environmental preservation, where the villagers found ways to live in harmony with nature, using modern tools to protect the river and the land. Lemmy's relationship with his mother grew stronger as they worked together to heal the wounds of the past. They shared laughter and tears, building a new life from the lessons they had learned. Lemmy knew that the road to redemption was not just about changing others, it was about changing himself, about learning that true progress came from understanding, from balance, and from the willingness to embrace both the past and the future. As the years passed, Lemmy became a respected leader in the village, not because of his defiance, but because of his ability to bring people together. The village, once divided between tradition and change, had found its balance. And Lemmy had found peace, not in rejecting his roots, but in building a future that honored both the wisdom of the past and the promise of the future. In the end, Lemmy understood that true peace came not from tearing down the old to make way for the new, but from blending the two. The balance between tradition and progress was the key to healing not just the broken bond between him and his village, but the bond between himself and the world around him.